Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
My introduction to this subject began on the morning of September 17, 2013, in a small Canadian town of Maitland along the St. Lawrence River in Ontario. I had just gotten my young son ready for school and onto the bus as I proceeded to enjoy a morning coffee on my day off. I continued to do a little work around the house until I received a call from an old friend in Ottawa who wanted to meet for coffee. It had been a while since I'd kept in touch after moving from the city of Ottawa to start a family business for my parents earlier that year. So I decided to take advantage of the open schedule before needing to be home for my son after school later that afternoon and left to meet my old friend in Ottawa. I lived right beside the highway on-ramp and was on my way rather quickly on that sunny yet windy fall day. As usual, I put some good music on and proceeded to enjoy the approximately 1 hour-long scenic drive to Ottawa. I rather liked and traveled this route quite often. It was an uneventful trip which had passed rather quickly as I began to approach the Ottawa city limits at about 12:20 p.m. At this point, in broad daylight without a cloud in the sky, I caught my eye up ahead in the distance on what at first came to mind as a very large seagull due to its white and gray appearance up in the sky. I still remember thinking to myself at the time, "That's a big seagull." Something was amiss, and within a blink or two I noticed that the wings did not match my initial interpretations. This was further away and much larger than at first perceived. I then noticed what looked like outstretched arms connected to a human-looking torso with a head and what I call legs, but which in fact more closely resembled a long serpent-looking tail flowing behind this winged being at the time. I do realize how strange this may sound, but I assure you that it is unfortunately all too real. The following events still go through my head incalculable times per day ever since they transpired several years ago. It was still far ahead as I continued driving my vehicle towards it at about 120 kilometers an hour. I could make out more and more details as I swiftly approached. Even at this distance, I could clearly identify this as a winged humanoid with a very dark body color. Initially, I described it as being like wet clay and a massive set of swan-like wings. These wings were seemingly oversized for its body and moved very slowly in almost 180-degree rotation, nearly touching its wing tips at the top and bottom of its graceful movements during flight. It was still fairly far ahead of me and appeared to be descending slowly along its path, which now paralleled the highway. The brilliant white wings took on a light gray appearance as they became shadowed from the bright sun by their own movements at times during flight. This was likely why I initially misidentified him as a seagull, which is typically gray and white in color and very common to the region. At this point, I was beyond certain that I was not mistaken in any way in my observations. My eyes and attention were completely diverted towards this incredible sight. I was at the time unaware, but after already observing this being for about 1 minute, that shock had certainly now taken complete hold of me. I was looking at something that just couldn't be real or actually happening to me. When suddenly another vehicle in the lane to my right came nearly into my path as I was also distracted and veering close to his traffic lane. We seemed to have both noticed the near collision at the same instant, corrected our steerings, made a half-second "do you see that?" type of eye-to-eye contact, and both looked back up at it in the sky simultaneously at that point to what had obviously been his focus at the time as well. He was driving a late 90s Buick of burgundy color and appeared to be a mid-40s Middle Eastern-looking man with short hair and medium build. Heart-jumping from the near high-speed collision, I could still see the being up in the air ahead as I looked back towards him as the road began turning slightly to the left, bringing this being into clearer and clearer view now to my right side. Slowly descending to a height where I could now see him looking over at myself and the other cars on the busy road that day as he flew adjacent to us for what felt like an eternity. The part that still sends chills down my spine was that this creature was clearly humanoid, but not like any human. His facial expression seemed highly intelligent, yet he portrayed a disdain and contemptuous demeanor as he looked over and down upon us with a confident air of supremacy. It was difficult to grasp or convey how truly intimidating this was. My only stunned reaction was of absolute fear and awe. His face was just as dark gray as the rest of his body, and he possessed a very square jawline with warrior-like prominent cheekbones. He also had predominant eye ridges which casted deep black shadows over portions of his face, including to his upper center lip due to the shadow from its nose under the sun. Besides the fact that this giant winged being descended from the sky, was the sheer size, dark color, and bulky muscle mass of his body that truly made this creature so fearsome. I estimated its height to be about 12 to 15 feet tall when compared to the surrounding trees. Its wingspan was disproportionately large for its body size, stretching approximately 25 to 30 feet across, and I even remember questioning at the time how such long wings would be stored when the creature was walking and not in flight. It was the most beautiful yet terrifying thing I have ever seen. I cannot overstress this statement. This being, now just above treetop level, began to glide as opposed to when its wings were flapping in full flight at its previous greater altitude. The wings were snow white as they nearly glowed in the bright sun and reminded me of those of a hawk in general shape and the way that the outer feathers were spread and angled slightly upward at the tips during this stage low level of flight. I now had a very clear horizontal side view of this winged being's outstretched body. His forward-reaching upper arms were as thick as I am, and nothing compared to the barrel-like size of his chest and back muscles. It was truly a supremely powerful being that would strike true fear in the bravest of men. Curiously, as opposed to when the being was first sighted about a minute and a half earlier, it now had two legs tucked back together as opposed to the longer tail-looking appendage that I had first observed. His head was now turned to his left, looking directly at me at this point, and it truly unnerved me and still continues to do so to this day. Looking eye to eye with this giant flying humanoid was a moment only surpassed by the tremendous shock, anxiety, and fear that it produced. After it flew over a thin row of trees, this being began to shift its body to a vertical position as he flared his wings out even more to slow down, now just a few meters from the ground, directly to my right, approaching an open field ahead of us. His attention now diverted to his landing. I could see his arms and legs somewhat awkwardly positioning themselves for a balance point as his wings acted like a giant sail in the powerful winds during his last wings outstretched airborne moments. He landed about 75 feet away from me, directly to my right in a clear unobstructed view. At this time I could also clearly see the inner feathers on his wings blowing feverishly in the strong wind. They were down-like and soft near his body, while the further to the outside of the wings I looked, the longer, stiffer, and more defined the feathers became. I'd previously thought in mythological cartoon-like terms that these beings were supposed to magically ascend, defying gravity with the accompaniment of light and singing, etc., but not the case here, where it was clearly observed being affected by, and had to follow the laws of nature from what I saw. It was as physically material and interrelating with its environment as a bird, human, or any other living creature would be. I was at this instant just passing ahead of this being, moving my view of him from the right passenger side window to the rear, and again the being turned his head and looked right at me, staring back at him as I now drove blindly just to get one last look at the being before the converging tree lines now in between us began to obscure my final view. All I can really remember was him ominously keeping eye contact with me for as long as was possible. To this day, I am unsure if he wanted me to stop, was maybe surprised that I could see him, or perhaps just wanted to make his presence known. Either way, I will never be able to forget that instant of time when I looked eye to eye and face to face, which can be described as nothing less than a supreme winged being. It had no facial hair, but wore some type of headdress gray in color resembling the shape of a modern Air Force flight cap. As well, I noticed that he wore his hair in braided or dreaded-looking pigtails coming out from under its cap on either side of its neck, hanging behind the ears going to the back of its shoulders. I could see from around its neck that it wore some type of tight-fitting robe matching its skin and color and being thin enough that I could see its muscles right through it. Upon its landing I could clearly see each of its legs, so it was probably a one-piece kilt-like garment that I was able to notice on the bottom half of his attire. He did not appear friendly or welcoming, and I will never forget the last seconds that I could see him and his ominous glare towards my direction that we shared through my back window. The witness sketch included here is of this last moment, which I could see between the trees before it was obscured from my view. I turned my head forward, seeing that I was again partially out of my lane due to the colossal distraction, then made a slight steering correction and noticed an exit 66 sign ahead as a reference to later determine the exact location of the event. Not 10 seconds later, the Ottawa skyline became visible from around the continual slightly uphill rightward bend in the road. I knew then that this being had landed as close to my nation's capital as is possible, while maintaining some degree of cover. This being was not exactly hiding either, as it paralleled one of Canada's busiest highways for nearly 2 minutes from what I observed. Had he landed just a field or two over to the east, he would likely have gone completely unnoticed. I still wonder if he wanted to be seen, or if he simply didn't care that we could see him. This creature had a wise and princely, yet beast-like air about it. He possessed a very serious and sophisticated nature which appeared as focused and determined as one on a mission of great importance. Ottawa is a beautiful city, but I don't believe that it was there to take in the sights. I suspect that someone in Ottawa that day knows a great deal more than I do about this entity and its reasons for being there. What I observed was beyond belief, even to my own eyes as I looked upon it. I can remember being unable to calmly mentally process this occurrence, as it did not fit my understanding at the time in any conceivable way. I did not ever think about, let alone believe in cryptids. Accepting this was not easy, as it negated all that I previously thought I knew. All I can remember about my brief meeting with my friend was that I was too shocked to say a thing about what had just occurred. I am certain that I must have appeared quite disturbed by something. All I wanted to do was get home, sit in private, and wrestle with making sense of what had happened and what I was to do about it. The shock was, in all honesty, nearly too much for me, pushing my personal limits to the edge of their capacity. This weight consumes me in enduring ways and has undoubtedly affected the course of my life since that afternoon. I remember watching the local news that night and the following day, hoping that something had been reported by another witness. I did consider coming forward at that time, but was trying to build a business in the small community and feared ridicule or negative impacts from coming forward. Besides, what do you even say to someone without appearing to have gone over the edge? Even I felt as though it was too unbelievable for anyone to believe me, even if I did tell them. I shared what happened with my brother, parents, son, and his mother over the following days, as I could not hide the shocking effect or the excitement and wonder from the event. Besides these close family members, I primarily kept the encounter to myself for the following 2 years, but slowly expanded the amount of those who knew of this event's occurrence to some additional friends and researchers in hopes of learning more about my experience. Due to the stigma and rarity of these events, they are not as easily received by others as, say, reports of flashing lights or disc-shaped objects commonly seen in the sky these days. Thus, I was not, as in many cases, predisposed to wanting to see anything like this at the time of the encounter. I did not really think about or believe in cryptids at all before the event, but can no longer deny their physical existence, only our human understanding of them. My goal is to find the others driving on the busy highway, the day that I know saw this being as well. There were at least 15 other cars in close proximity to myself during this encounter. It has taken me years to come forward with what I saw, and I've still only shared it with a handful of trusted people until now. As well, Ottawa is a government, military, and technological center with many professionals that, despite seeing this, may understandably prefer to keep their pension and stay out of the mental health institutions by keeping it to themselves. Before this event, I would honestly have found it very difficult to believe such a description from any other person, even if they were trusted and very close to me. Understanding this, I'm uncertain as to how to best convey this event to you in a way that I would have been receptive to, if this is even possible to share fully in words without seeing this winged being for yourself. I swear to my family that my description of and sighting of this giant winged being are true and as accurately described to you as is humanly possible. Thank you for listening to my experience, and again, I do not share this in the interest of personal gain, be it financial, egotistical, or otherwise, but as something for the greater benefit of all. My witness sketch is a pretty close depiction of what was observed, except that the pencil that I used to shade the body does not exactly match the deepness of the gray body color actually witnessed, which more closely resembled the color of the serpent pictured below. Pardon the condition of the picture, as it's been a little soiled in its travels over the years, having been hung in my bedroom and used as the cover to my handwritten notes for some time.
I spent the month of September in Ottawa, Ontario at my close friend's home. I used to live on a farm with them 7 years ago. I was a caregiver to their 92-year-old grandmother. She suffered from dementia. Sometimes she was lucid and would tell me stories of her life, but most of the time she just wasn't there. She'd come out of her room sometimes saying she wanted the strawberry jam she made in the summer probably 50 years ago. She would attempt to go down the cellar stairs to the cold room to get the jam, and we would stop her gently and guide her back to her room. She was persistent about that jam, and one night she managed to get to the stairs before anyone noticed. She fell to the bottom and broke most of the bones in her frail old body. She passed away in her grandson's arms. She said she was going to get the jam and smiled, and then she was gone. My friends have her ashes in their new home in the city. They're kept in an antique china cabinet in the dining room. The china cabinet contains curios that belonged to Granny. Well, one night I was sitting, surfing the laptop computer at the end of the dining room table with my back to the cabinet, and I heard a loud sound like someone clanking 2 wine glasses together. It came from the cabinet. I was all alone in that house. I think it was Grandma saying hello to me. It freaked me the hell out. My friends came home and I told them about the sound, and they said it happens to them too. She is there with them in that house.
In the late 1970s, I lived in Ottawa, Ontario, and rode a red 1969 Rocket 3BSA motorcycle. They were all red, so that part doesn't matter. I've only seen the slime green version in books. The 1969 divided by 70 Rocket 3s are as ugly as sin, with a shoebox gas tank and unmistakable gaudy mufflers nicknamed Flash Gordons. They're high maintenance, expensive, and, even then, very, very rare. But they're a great bike, and I wouldn't trade mine for the world. Back then I used to race it a bit and remove the high stock handlebars so I could use flat bars instead and fitted bar end mirrors on both sides. Bar ends were also fairly rare and I had to buy mine mail order from Toronto. As full-face helmets were just coming in and not popular, most riders still rode with an open-faced brain bucket, not a white Honda line like myself. I also wore, and this was habitual to me at the time, a Canadian Army surplus khaki green bush jacket, and although there were plenty of genuine motorcycle gloves available, I used cheap tan leather work gloves, known as ropers. I was pretty distinctive, by anyone's standards. Just before dusk in midsummer, I was riding west through the city on Highway 417, locally known as the Queensway, and looked across into the eastbound lane. There was another motorcyclist there. He rode a 1969 or 70 BSA Rocket 3 with flat bars, bar end mirrors, stock tank and exhaust system, wearing a white full-face helmet, army bush jacket and ropers. I'm not saying anything, one way or the other, I'm just asking. What are the odds?
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.